Okay, this could be my notes and reflections on Chapter 13 of B.J. Penn's autobiographical book, Why I Fight. And Chapter 13 is entitled Full Circle. And the title of that chapter is so named because this is the chapter where he comes back into the UFC. Previously, in the earlier Chapter 11 and 12, he had tied for the lightweight world championship belt in the UFC, and then they eliminated that weight category altogether. And then he went up to the welterweight. He fought Matt Hughes. He beat Matt Hughes, submitted him, and so he was the welterweight champion of the world. And then the UFC was kind of like stalling on getting him some good guys in there to fight. And so he decided while he was waiting, he was going to go into K1. They were offering him some good money. And, and that was another thing. He was negotiating for a new contract with the UFC too. And not only were they not finding him the right fights with some good fighters, but they were also offering pretty scrub money, like maybe a fifth of the money per fight that K1 was willing to pay him. So he decided to go into K1 and do some fights, and this upset the UFC, and they stripped him of his belt, stripped him of his title. They allowed Matt Hughes to fight George St-Pierre to regain his title, even though nobody ever beat B.J. Penn for that title. So, he goes into K1 and he takes a couple of fights. He had originally hoped going into K1 that he would be matched up against some of the better Japanese fighters that probably were not going to be seen in the UFC. That didn't happen. They kept matching him up with some of the fighters that were from kind of the North American circuit that they had recruited into K1. And going into Chapter 13 here, he's doing his third and final fight on his K1 contract, and it's the same way. He ends up getting set up to fight Renzo Gracie, and the fight is actually not even going to take place in Japan, but rather in Hawaii. And for BJ, that's a good thing, because he likes to fight in Hawaii and put on a show for his people in Hawaii. But the challenge in fighting Renzo Gracie is mainly, there's a couple of things. First of all, there's this sense that ever since his deal with Ralph Gracie, where he left Ralph Gracie's school to go and improve himself in some other schools, there's always been kind of this backstory of him having bad blood with the Gracies, and his perspective is really that it's not the Gracies as a whole, but Ralph Gracie. But it seems that the Gracies as a whole kind of, because they're family, they back each other up, so there is some bad blood there, and we kind of can see that play out a little bit in his fight against Renzo. Now Renzo is not welterweight size guy, so basically he's like a light heavyweight, and so BJ needs to go up in the weight scale again. He had started off as a lightweight and did everything he could as a lightweight, beat the best guys, and then that he could, and then moved up to welterweight to start getting some good fights again, and now he's into the light heavyweight to fight or middleweight, I think it was called. Let me look to make sure, but because I know I messed up on my Chapter 11 review calling the welterweight bantamweight, so I do stuff like that because I really don't know the fight scene that much. Okay, yeah, it's called middleweight. What Renzo is, and I think it's like 185 or something like that. So BJ needs to pack on some more weight, and he ends up, I think he weighed in at like 190 or something in that range for the fight. So he's carrying a lot more weight than he's used to, And this may be part of what in the fight ends up kind of like tiring him out. But overall, he gets at least 2 rounds to Renzo's, and he wins by the fight by judge's decision. They go the whole 3 rounds. He wins by judge's decision, and then he goes to shake hands with the Gracie's guys, and they just kind of snub him. I recognize Hicks and Gracie. I didn't recognize the other guys there because I'm just not into the scene enough. Somebody else might. Oh, I recognize Matt Serra as well. He's not a Gracie, but he's very closely associated with Renzo. So, but yeah, when BJ was over there after the fight, trying to like shake hands with him and stuff, you can just see them all kind of like just turn a cold shoulder to him. So there's some bad feelings there or whatever. Then he's still trying to negotiate with the UFC. He's got this choice. He can continue with K1 or whatever, but he's really not getting the kind of fights that he wants. And he really does want to be in the UFC. He wants to be in there. Things are not going well with his, or not going fast enough, I guess, with his litigious approach with the UFC. And although he might ultimately win his court battles, he's not going to get hired by the UFC again, and that takes him out of, the kind of the limelight of mixed martial arts fighting, because even in the little time that, this had been going on, 2005, UFC had grown, again, another huge leap in the public eye. They started their The Ultimate Fighter reality show to select new fighters for the UFC, and BJ is seeing some of his friends and people he'd been fighting, in the day with, going in as coaches and the Ultimate Fighter, and they get to be on TV and all this, and he's getting a little bit jealous of all this stuff. He wants to be in the scene. He wants to be in the action of where things are happening. So in the trials, or as they're going through their court stuff, they're waiting for a particular court date, but BJ finally just kind of has it laid out on the table that he wants back in the UFC. They need to negotiate something, so they throw him and Dana White in a room together, and the two of them go back and forth until it's decided, okay, we're going to bring you back in. So BJ takes it at a loss, but also at a gain, because he's basically losing his place in the game by not accepting the UFC's scrub financial offers. And he really just wants to be fighting. He wants to be in there, and a lot of the best fighters are going into the UFC. That's where he's going to get his matches, and that's where he does have his titles, or had them before they were stripped. So he's going back into the UFC, and the first fight they set him up with is none other than George St-Pierre, the guy who had recently fought Matt Hughes and lost for the welterweight championship. So going through St-Pierre is a route to fighting Hughes again to get his championship back. As with, a number of his recent, his number of his fights in 2003, 4, 5, and his fight with St-Pierre is going into 2006. So he'd had a number of years there where he didn't really have any fight training strategy. He just trained. He just got a group of guys together. He's doing his training. He did have kind of a little magical thing going on there for a little bit, where he'd go up to Oregon, go to Randy Couture's house, and train there for a little bit because it worked in one earlier fight, and then he'd go back to Hawaii and do his group. But now he's just in Hawaii. He's got his little group together, and they're just training, and they're not really using any particular strategy that he talks about. And so he's getting ready for George St-Pierre. The fight night comes. This is welterweight. He goes into the fight with St-Pierre, and he doesn't mention it, but I've been watching the fights as I read the book, and or at least I don't remember him mention it. But when he walks out to the octagon for the St-Pierre fight, he's wearing his welterweight championship belt. So while they stripped the title, I guess they never got the physical belt from him because he's wearing it on his way out there. But even though he's doing that, like he's showcasing he is the champion in all of this, when he gets into the ring, he doesn't have that kind of like in his earlier fights, he's like an animal chomping at the bit. He's pacing and he's just hungry. That's what it is. It's like this hunger for the fight. And he doesn't really have that as he gets in the octagon this time. I don't see that hunger registering. He is, he's ready to fight, but he's not hungry for it, eh? And they get into the fight. GSP, like usual, like he's kind of a bleeder, and it's not too hard to open him up. So even in the first round, he's got his nose broken by a little glance. He's got, his eye got poked somehow, and his eye is all swollen up, and he looks like battered after the first round. In the first round, it does look like BJ did the better of the fighting in the first round. Going into the second, however, while George continues to bleed and stuff, he's really, in my opinion, he was putting up the better fight. BJ was starting to get tired and was starting to show. And by third round, it was really George that was there in the fight, and BJ was just kind of like holding on. He was, he does a good job of masking how tired he is, but he's obviously really tired. And he mentions it in the book. He doesn't understand why he gets so tired. He thinks maybe it has to do with, a diet, or he's partying around, when he's not fighting, because he does still party and all of this. But he doesn't really know what it is that's holding him back, where, he can train really good for long periods of time. He gets in the ring and, he loses steam so quick. But in his opinion, BJ's opinion, he won the fight, maybe by a small margin, but he won the fight with St-Pierre. He certainly had the more impact, physically on St-Pierre. But in my opinion, watching the fight, the physical impact that he had is really because St-Pierre's, I don't know, he's got thin skin or something, and he just gets cut up and bruised real easy. But as far as technical fighting was concerned and everything, I agree with what the judges decided, which was that St-Pierre won the fight. And so this is a real letdown for BJ, because this was supposed to be his big. They were building it up too, and Joe Rogan's there commenting about the big comeback that BJ's making and all of this, and but he loses the fight, and so he's that much further away from Matt Hughes and his welterweight title again, and who knows what's going to happen to him. This is only the first fight on his new contract, but he's not happy, and I don't blame him. And so this is where it's at, but I am, fight by fight, I am seeing less of the hunger in BJ, and I'll be interested to see if it turns and he gets real hungry again. I don't know, but my thoughts on the chapter, it was just a very short chapter, but there's a lot of stuff in there, and I think my reflections I kind of inserted as we went along. So yeah, on to chapter 14.